Here at the IMF headquarters in Washington D.C, I have with me the Deputy Director of the Asia and Pacific Department of the International Monetary Fund, Sanjay Panth. Thank you very much for agreeing to record this interview with me. I think it's very important for us in Sri Lanka to understand what the IMF has to say about Sri Lanka's progress and the current circumstances. We've heard from the Managing Director, the Asia Pacific Department Director as well, about the ongoing uncertainties, the vulnerabilities that global economies face, and especially small economies as Sri Lanka. And in Sri Lanka, there is now ongoing debate regarding fiscal consolidation, balancing the need to protect growth and livelihoods. Is there help from the IMF or how must authorities strike the balance between fiscal discipline and also economic recovery, reform and growth without stalling recovery? Are there any risks to sustaining momentum into 2025 and beyond?
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. Thank you for talking with me. It's my pleasure to be able to be here to talk about these very important issues for Sri Lanka as well as for the IMF. Look, on the issue that you raised, I think it's very important that when you have fiscal consolidation, it is done in a way that's consistent with social and political feasibility as well, because you need the buy-in of the population, you need the population to be committed to the reform program as a whole. It's not just the government. And to that extent, I must say, Sri Lanka is a remarkable story of how the entire population has come together from a very deep crisis, has gone through a very painful period of adjustment, and now they're beginning to feel the fruits of the hard years. Things are turning around, things are improving. After all the pain, after everything that the country has gone through, this is the moment now to, in a sense, consolidate the gains that have been made so far and continue on the progress going forward. In many ways, the hardest part is behind you now. You talked about fiscal consolidation. The primary balance of the medium-term program is within reach. The revenues have picked up and are doing very well. So the key is to avoid complacency and to make sure that these issues are sustained going forward so that the fiscal situation is amenable to providing opportunities for growth, opportunities for greater economic participation. For example, capital spending is a very important component of the fiscal, and you need revenues for that going forward. So I think the biggest risk in many ways, and this is not about Sri Lanka, this is what we've seen in many programs, but also in the case of Sri Lanka in previous programs, is to stay the course, wait until completion, and not roll back again.
Sri Lanka is at the point where structural reforms must translate into private sector confidence and investment. How can IMF-supported programs better align with measures that attract sustainable growth and private capital into markets like Sri Lanka? Are there any reforms needed to address FDI bottlenecks that exist within our markets?
Thank you. Again, another excellent question. In general, the best way to attract FDI and capital into the country requires about 3 or 4 things. You need continued macroeconomic stability. You need to have predictability and continuity of policies. And you need to have transparency. And again, the Sri Lanka program, the homegrown program that Sri Lanka has, embodies all of this. We just talked about macroeconomic stability. You've achieved a lot going there. In terms of policy continuity and predictability, the government is continuing the reform program going forward. And then on the last part, on the transparency, the governance framework that we have, that we've worked together as part of the program, is very important going forward. What people need for investment is to feel that their investment is fair, it's transparent, and that it's a level playing field. One thing I think that is not a good way to attract investment, because it's not always the best investment, not sustained investment, is through tax exemptions, right? So just giving tax exemptions themselves don't work. And again, here Sri Lanka is making a lot of progress. We're looking at the Port City Act, we're looking at the other act as well together to make the whole policy more predictable, transparent, and also ultimately in the interest of the Sri Lankan population.
Right, and then public trust in the reform program has swayed continually, whether it was going to the IMF or now post entering into an agreement with the IMF. And it also depends on visible protection for vulnerable groups. How is the IMF adapting your policy framework to ensure that in countries like Sri Lanka, adjustment programs don't widen inequality that we already have in countries like Sri Lanka?
Again, excellent. Yes, I'm very happy to address that. As a general rule, IMF programs nowadays pay a lot of attention to making sure there's enough fiscal spending on the poor. We have social protection floors that it's part of the program. Countries are required to meet that going forward. And we've had the same with Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, in many ways, unlike some of the other areas, this is where we would like to see more progress in Sri Lanka. The social protection floor has not been met consistently on the target set under the program. So I think that's where renewed effort, renewed energizing is necessary for the reasons that you mentioned, to make sure that the vulnerable are protected. In this respect, in Sri Lanka in particular, I think the Asvestima program is a cornerstone of what the government has been trying to do. There have been some teething problems with that, and I think there's a second round being considered now, and I think you want to make sure that the social protection is targeted, and that issues of inclusion and exclusion are also properly dealt, in the sense that people who genuinely need the social protection are brought into the net, and those who don't are not taking resources away from those who do. So I would encourage the Sri Lankan authorities to really focus on this part of the program in a big way going forward as well, and to continue to work with the Asvestima program and other similar programs.
Are there success stories from any other countries where similar programs have been implemented?
Yeah. I mean, we generally have programs where we have this as a criterion, and mostly we do. It's whenever we complete a program review, we go to the board and we make sure that this part of the program is also reported on, and this is true across our programs.
The IMF also urges throughout your reviews for Sri Lanka to tackle revenue leakages, rationalize tax exemptions, and strengthen public financial management as essential to sustaining Sri Lanka's progress. Now, what are the biggest sources of revenue leakages you have identified within Sri Lanka's system, and how authorities close these loopholes, especially when there is resistance? How do you identify these?
In Sri Lanka's case, I think one needs to keep in mind that there was a very large reduction in the number of people in the taxpayers' net. Mm-hmm. This happened during the crisis and earlier also because of all the exemptions that were given. And I think the biggest thing now is it's not so much increasing the overall tax burden, but making sure it's more equitable and more fair, that people pay the parts, particularly those who can afford to do that. And I think there are 3 or 4 things that are very big parts of the program that we encourage you to continue following. One of these is to look at the exemptions, to roll back exemptions where we see where there's scope. The other area is to improve compliance, and I think particularly of the large and well-off taxpayers. Put in place mechanisms, have large taxpayer units, for example, in the ministries, in the revenue collection authorities, to follow up on these things. And then the third thing that I would say is to strengthen the registration requirement, to make sure that people who should be in the tax net are registered and continue to pay their tax obligations.
But Sri Lanka, people, those who are taxed, feel that it is the middle income earners, those who are trapped below a certain category, are being taxed under an IMF program.
That's exactly the point that I'm trying to raise, which is the fact that I think the focus should be on making sure that the burden is spread equitably, and that it doesn't fall disproportionately on just those who are actually paying taxes. Those who are not paying taxes are the ones you want to go after and bring back into the net, so the overall burden is lesser on those who are actually paying the taxes.
Certainly, state-owned enterprises now too carry legacy debts, and that has been a major issue for Sri Lanka over many years, even prior to the crisis, and often requires subsidized tariffs, and people continue to support these through taxes. What must be the focus to ensure SOE reform and debt cleanup, especially in the energy sector, and that ensure that they don't derail the broader programs to or shift the burden back on the budget? We have the 2026 budget upcoming.
Absolutely. I think, look, commercial enterprises need to be run to make sure that they do not add to the general country's problems by having their negative spillovers on the federal government, on the state government, right? So that is the issue that we're seeing in many places. In Sri Lanka also, there are a lot of problems. You alluded to that on the state-owned enterprise sector, and I think the government from the start of the program has been quite cognizant of the need to address these issues. And the way they have tried to do it, and the way we're supporting them as they try to do this, is basically through governance reforms, making sure these are run well. Secondly, addressing some of the old legacy issues, like some of them have unsustainable debt. Now those are being addressed. And then the third thing is to make sure that there is, cost recovery ultimately at the end of the day. The electricity pricing is a very good example of that, but there are others as well, and I think that's what needs to be continued to be done. Issues like making sure there are enterprises that don't have foreign exchange earnings cannot go out and borrow because then they can't be paid back. This is something that the government is committed to try to do. Limiting guarantees by the government. So these are the areas that I think need to be continued to be focused on.
The energy pricing, I think we have seen developments over these past few days back in Sri Lanka, but the IMF has reiterated that Sri Lanka must maintain cost recovery energy pricing formula, and that contains fiscal risks and ensure the financial visibility of the energy sector and utilities are maintained. So given public backlash and risks and affordability concerns, what flexibility do you see that the implementing the cost recovery pricing formula has, and what kind of leeway does the program provide for Sri Lanka?
For us, the most important thing is to continue to ensure there is cost recovery. I think that is very important because ultimately, if the enterprise cannot pay for its costs, it'll come back on the budget, and that's what we want to try to avoid. There is a program conditionality that requires continuous meeting of this structural benchmark, and we will look at it. We're assessing it, and we'll see whether it complies with the benchmark or not. In addition, what I would suggest is that there are ways also to reduce the cost of energy, right? And that's one area to focus on going forward. Sri Lanka has pretty high electricity rates compared to many parts of the world. Continue to be able to invest in some of these areas for the government to be able to, make sure that the cost of power itself reduces will ultimately be, then that will allow the government to reduce the prices, which will then, feed into everybody going forward. I think the other part that you mentioned also comes out about transparency and accountability. I think it's very important for public entities, and this again is part of the commitment of the government, is to try to make sure that there are audited statements that are put out so that people see what the cost is, what the benefits is, what the risks are. And so that in a sense will let people understand what the problems are, because just making sure that the cost itself is the price is below cost does not work, as we've seen.
And that also brings us to FDI's investments, the recovery program, the reforms agenda, translating into stronger inflows to the country. So what signs, signals should investors be looking for to know that Sri Lanka is on a sustainable path, and how must Sri Lanka be working towards this?
Thank you. I think the signals are out there. I think we're seeing this. The economy is picking up. The debt restructuring part, which is such a big part of the story over the last few years, is mostly behind us. The government's finances are being put into order. There is this huge issue of governance that the current government is also very focused on. Corruption, reducing corruption is a big element of what they want to do, and which we very strongly support. Ultimately, investors want to make sure that the rule of law is there, that there is macroeconomic stability, that they get good returns, and there's a level playing field. I think the signals are all there. The question, as I said, is to continue to convince everybody that Sri Lanka will see this to its end. The end is not there yet. We're only halfway through the program, and we need to continue in the path we're there. But the signals are already beginning to emerge.
But somehow there is opposition also within the country, feeling that the IMF is more lenient towards the present authority. But apart from that, in terms of debt servicing by 2028, do you think Sri Lanka is again on course to sustain our revenues and to be able to pay our debt by then?
You are on course, but the task is not completed, right? So you're on course because you've achieved huge milestones under the program. As I mentioned, the primary balance, you're there, already practically there this year. You have the revenue, but at the same time, even after the restructuring, debt is going to be high. It's going to be pretty high. So you need to continue to persevere and make sure that now the issue is not so much just the overall quantum of the revenues, but the sustainability of that going forward. Because some of the revenues that we're getting right now are from areas that will not be sustained. There's a lot of pent-up demand, for example. So there's been a huge import of cars, and some of that revenue is coming from that. That will not exist for every year going forward. So you need to make sure to stick with it, to make sure all of these things are not just there for a year or two, but are there going forward. And with that, you'll reach the point.
By the end of 2025, or even beyond that, by the end of the program, how would you describe success for Sri Lanka looks like, not just in numbers, but Sri Lanka?
I think ultimately, look, a program is successful if it meets the objectives. The objective fundamentally is to make sure the Sri Lanka's financial situation is under control, in the sense that the government is able to invest in its people, in its growth prospects going forward, in making sure it's taking care of its most vulnerable people, in making sure that there are no risks, or the risks that are there are minimized in terms of being able to cause another crisis or another panic or all of that. And I think that's ultimately what everybody will be looking for as the signals of where the country is.
Thank you very much for your time. I know this is a very busy week here in Washington, but thank you for taking these questions.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
We were in conversation with Sanjay Panth, the Deputy Director of the International Monetary Fund's Asia and Pacific Department. I'm reporting from Washington, D.C., where the IMF headquarters is.
You are watching the Derana News Channel, Sri Lanka's #1 news source.